Rail, Reims, Belgium, Bixschoote, and then it fell back into the gloomy dug-out, where the flame of the single candle traced disquieting shadows on the wall. Suddenly a cold breath of air blew into my retreat. The door opened abruptly, and at the top of the steps a man, stooping over the floor of the passage, called to me in an undertone. "Mon Lieutenant, come and see! Something is happening!" With a bound I sprang up from my shelter and climbed up the ledge. "Listen, Mon Lieutenant!" That night in the trenches was destined to overwhelm me with astonishment, and this one surpassed all that I could imagine. I should like to be able to impart the extraordinary impression I felt, but one would have to have been there that night to be capable of realizing it. Over that vast and silent plain, in which everything seemed to sleep, and where no other sound was heard, there resounded from afar a voice whose notes, in spite of the distance, reached our ears. What an extraordinary thing it was! That song, vibrating through the boundless night, made our hearts beat and stirred us more than the most perfectly ordered concert given by the most famous of singers. And it was another hymn, unknown to us, coming from the German trenches far away on our right. The singer must have been standing out in the fields on the edge of their line. He must have been moving, coming towards us, and passing slowly along the enemy's positions, for his voice came gradually nearer and became louder and clearer. Every now and then it ceased, and then hundreds of other voices responded in chorus with some phrases which formed the refrain of the hymn. Then the soloist began again and came still nearer to us. He must have come from a considerable distance, for our chasseurs had already heard him for some time before they decided to call me. Who could this man have been, who must have been sent all along the front of the troops to pray whilst each German company waited for him, so as to join in with him in prayer? Some minister, no doubt, who had come to remind the soldiers of the sanctity of that night and the solemnity of the hour. Soon we heard the voice coming from the trenches straight in front of us. In spite of the brightness of the night, we could not distinguish the singer, for the two lines at that point were 400 yards apart. But he was certainly not hiding himself, for his deep voice would never have sounded so rich and clear to us had he been singing at the bottom of their trenches. Again it ceased, and then the Germans directly in front of us, the soldiers occupying the works opposite ours, those men whom we were bound to kill as soon as they appeared, and whose duty it was to shoot us as soon as we showed ourselves, those men calmly took up the refrain of the hymn, with its sweet and mysterious words. They too must have come to the edge of their trench and struck up their hymn with their faces towards us, for their notes came to us clearly and distinctly. I looked along the line of our trench. All our men, too, were awake and looking on. They had all got on to the ledge, and several had left the trench and were in the field, listening to the unexpected concert. No one was offended by it. No one laughed at it. Rather, there was a trace of regret in the attitudes and the faces of those who were nearest to me. And yet it would have been such a simple matter to put an end to that scene. A volley fired by the troop there, and it would all stop, and drop back into the quiet of other nights. But nobody thought of such a thing. There was not one of our chasseurs who would not have considered it a sacrilege to fire upon those praying soldiers. We felt, indeed, that there are hours when one can forget that one is there to kill. This would not prevent us from doing our duty immediately afterwards. The voice drew further away, and retreated slowly and majestically towards the trenches situated at the place known as the Troopers of C's ground, where our two lines approached each other within a distance of 50 yards. How much more touching the sight must have been from there! I wished my post had been in that direction, so that I might have been present at the scene, might have heard the words, and distinguished the figure of the pastor walking along the parapets made for hurling out death, and blessing those who next day might be no more. Ping! A shot was heard. The stupid bullet, which had perhaps found its mark? At once there was dead silence, not a cry, not an oath, not a groan. Some would have thought he was doing well by firing on that man. A pity. We should gain nothing by preventing them from keeping Christmas in their own way, and it would have been a nobler thing to reserve our blows for other hecatombs. I know that the barbarians would not have hesitated had they been in our place, and that so many of our priests had fallen under their strokes, that they could not reasonably have reproached us. There are people who will say that our hatred should embrace everything German, that we should be implacable towards everything bearing that name, and spare none of the excreated race which has been the cause of so many tears, so much blood, so much mourning. Never mind. I think in this case it would have been better not to have shot. A shot fired, not far from us, on our left, brought me up from my shelter. It seemed strange after that complete calm of the night. It was 7 o'clock. The sun was magnificent, and had already bathed the deserted plain, the fields, the heights of S, and the ruined village. In the distance towards the east, the towers of the Cathedral of R stood out proudly against the golden sky. I looked and saw that all my chasseurs standing on the ledges waiting with interest a scene which seemed to be going on in front of the trenches, occupied on our left by the Territorials. I got up by the side of one of them, and he explained to me what was happening. "Mon Lieutenant, it's the infantry fellows who have just killed a hare that ran between the two lines. They're going to fetch it." And, in fact, I saw this strange sight. 2 men had gone out in full daylight from their trenches, and were advancing with hesitating steps towards the enemies. Behind them were 100 inquisitive heads, looking out above the embrasures arranged between the sacks of earth. A few soldiers, who had come out of the trench, were even sitting on the bank of chalky earth. It was certainly such a scene as I had hardly expected to witness. What was the captain of the company occupying the trench doing? But my astonishment became stupefaction when I saw hundreds of heads that fringed the enemy's trenches. I at once sent G. and a non-commissioned officer with the following order to all our men: "No one is to show himself. Every man to his fighting post. Carbines loaded and ready to fire." The Germans opposite became suspicious on seeing our line so silent, and no man showing himself. They, too, waited on the alert behind their loopholes. But along the rest of their front their men kept on coming out of their trenches unarmed, and making merry and friendly gestures. I became uneasy, and wondered how this unexpected comedy might end. Ought I to have those men fired upon who were not quite opposite to us, and whose opponents seemed rather inclined to make a Christmas truce? Our 2 infantrymen had come to the spot where the hare had fallen, very nearly half-way between the French and German lines. One of them stooped down and got up again, proudly brandishing his victim in the enemy's faces. At once there was a burst of applause from the German lines. They called out, "Kameraden! Kameraden!" This was going too far. I saw 2 unarmed Prussians leave their trench and come forward with their hands raised towards the 2 Frenchmen. So I consulted G. Ought we to fire? I confess it would be rather unpleasant for me to order our fellows to fire upon these unarmed men. On the other hand, can we allow the least intercourse between the barbarous nation that is still treading our soil and our good brothers-in-arms who are pouring out their blood every day to reconquer it? Fortunately, the officer who commanded the St. Thierry artillery, and who had observed this scene with his glasses, spared me a decision which would have been painful to me. Pong, 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 pong! 4 shells passed, hissing over our heads, and burst with admirable precision 200 yards above the German trenches. The artillery officer seemed to have placed with a delicate hand the 4 little white puffs of smoke which, equidistant from each other, appeared to mark out the bounds in the heavens of the frontier line he wished to forbid the enemy to pass on the earth. The Germans did not fail to understand this graceful warning. With cries of rage and protest, they ran back to their shelters, and our Frenchman did the same. And, as though to mark the intentional kindness of what he had just done, hardly had the last of the spiked helmets disappeared behind the parapets, when again the same hissing noise was heard, and pong, 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 pong! 4 shells dropped, this time full upon the whitish line formed along the green plain by the upturned earth of their trenches. In the midst of the smoke, earth and rubbish of all kinds were seen flying. Our chasseurs cried, "Bravo!" Everyone felt that the best solution had been found, and rejoiced at the termination of the brief Christmas truce. And now our minds were free to rejoice in the great day itself, in company with our good troopers. In the night there had arrived, well packed in smart hampers, the bottles of champagne which Major B. had presented to his men, and we were looking forward to the time, only a few hours hence, when the soup would be upon the table, and we should keep our Christmas by letting off the corks in the direction of the German trenches.